on GB News. We make use of our gas resources here at home. I'll speak to two MPs about these issues, look ahead to PMQs and an interesting proposal for the Homes for Ukraine scheme. All that and more coming up after your morning headlines.
Good morning, it's 9:31. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Emergency services in Ukraine's capital, Kiev, have been evacuating residents as Russian airstrikes have hit 2 blocks of flats overnight. It's as air raid sirens have been heard in several cities across the country overnight and into this morning. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky said peace talks were sounding more realistic, but more time was needed.
It is difficult, but important, as any war ends with an agreement. The meetings continue, and I'm informed the positions during the negotiations already sound more realistic. But time is still needed for the decisions to be in the interests of Ukraine.
The Prime Minister says there's no way Ukraine will join NATO anytime soon. It comes as President Zelensky says the alliance has no intention of accepting his country. The UK's Defence Secretary Ben Wallace is meeting with his NATO counterparts today to discuss Russia's invasion. The Polish Prime Minister has told President Zelensky the EU will never leave Ukraine alone. It was during a visit to Kiev with the Slovenian and Czech Prime Ministers, who were the first EU leaders to visit the capital since the invasion started. Poland and the Czech Republic are strong supporters of Ukraine joining the EU. Talks with Iran to free Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe are going right up to the wire, Boris Johnson has said. The Prime Minister added negotiations with Tehran over releasing the British-Iranian national were moving forward. Hopes for Nazanin's release has been raised yesterday after it was confirmed her British passport had been returned. Labour MP Tulip Siddiq told GB News earlier the situation for her return to the UK looks more hopeful than ever. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to the briefing with Tom Harwood.
A very good morning to you. It's 9:33 and this is the briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Now, the Prime Minister will not be at the dispatch box at midday today, as usual, because this morning he touched down in Abu Dhabi. And he's off to Saudi Arabia this afternoon too. Yes, Boris's visit aims to strengthen ties between the UK and the Gulf as the West moves away from dependence on Russian oil supplies. This isn't without controversy, however. The UAE and Saudi Arabia have both faced fierce backlash over their human rights records, including Saturday's mass beheading of 81 prisoners and, of course, the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. Well, joining me now to discuss these issues is member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and Labour MP, Graham Stringer. Welcome to the programme, Graham. First of all, I suppose it's a moral quandary. We know that we don't want to get oil and gas from Russia. We know that Europe is moving away from that. But equally, we can't suddenly stop using oil and gas in mere days, weeks, or even months. So we've got to get it from somewhere. How does the UK government balance that with the very real human rights concerns?
I think it's difficult, but the fact is that the Russians are killing thousands and thousands of people, both on their own side, sort of young conscripted men, and Ukrainian citizens. I think although one would wish Saudi Arabia to have a different system than they do, there is no comparison in terms of what they are doing to the Russians. So if we want to put more pressure on Russia, we have to have an alternative supply of oil and gas. I also think it's worth saying that our high horse on these things shouldn't be quite so high. We regularly give money in aid to countries that have capital punishment and have pretty awful regimes. And secondly, within my lifetime, we have executed people who turned out after they've been executed to be innocent. So, and by the way, for most of the time since we got rid of capital punishment, which I support getting rid of capital punishment, a majority of people in this country have been in favour of it. So even the moral arguments aren't quite as clean-cut as you might think they are.
Certainly, there is a question over capital punishment. However, I think describing what goes on in Saudi Arabia as simply capital punishment when it's brutal beheadings of political dissidents does seem to be sanitising it somewhat.
I am not trying to sanitise it. I am saying that we've had capital punishment. Many people in this country support it. I don't support either capital punishment or the way the Saudi Arabian regime organises itself. It's not just that they behead people, it is also that they torture people, and their system of justice would not be recognisable under that name in this country. It's not a system I support. I'm just saying that probably our position is not as morally pure as sometimes people think it is.
And circling back to what you mentioned at the start of your first answer, the idea that we can't compare what goes on in Saudi Arabia with the brutal expansionist regime of Vladimir Putin, the way that he has attacked Europe in the way that he has. I wonder if it's possible here to sort of rank dictators from the absolutely unconscionable to the only slightly awful.
It's not an exercise I would particularly wish to do, but I think when we are talking about securing the supply of energy for our country, trying to get some control on the prices, in practice, you have to do that. The Saudi Arabian regime is not the same as the Russian. The Russians are killing thousands of people in the Ukraine at the moment, and it's a pretty awful sum to do. But I think it's a sum that has to be done. And incidentally, there is nothing new in this. In the Second World War, we were allied with Stalin, who had already sent millions of people to death, both in Ukraine and by exiling people into the Gulag in Siberia. We helped what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. We helped them win that war by sending supplies, both of weapons and food, to Russia during the latter parts of the Second World War. So these pretty awful dilemmas are things that governments have to face in times of existential crisis.
Yes, and I suppose it is important to have an ally in the region and someone who we can speak to, and hopefully they'll listen. But I suppose that brings me on to my next question. What is the chance of success in today's visit by the Prime Minister? Of course, Saudi Arabia is a member of OPEC. They, as a cartel, a group of countries, decide how much oil they're putting out, and that affects the oil price. They might not necessarily by themselves be able to change much. What do you gauge is the chance of success of the Prime Minister's visit today?
That's another difficult question you're asking me. The only answer I can give is our Prime Minister, who I have many criticisms of, has, I think, quite sensibly kept his lines of communication open with Saudi Arabia, because, as you say, in the rather difficult situation in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia is our ally against the terror-supporting Iranians and some other regimes, and Johnson has recognised that. So I think if any Prime Minister or President can get a deal to supply us with oil out of the Saudis, then he is likely to be the one who can do that.
Well, on behalf of the whole country, I suppose, fingers crossed. But for now, Graham Stringer, member of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, thank you for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Now, more than 120,000 Brits have signed up to express their interest in the Homes for Ukraine scheme, opening their doors to welcome Ukrainian refugees fleeing Putin's brutal war of aggression. It's an impressive number, 120,000 individuals, and potentially a far larger number than that of Ukrainian families who'd want to come all the way to the UK. So I wonder, is there an opportunity here? Currently, thousands of other refugees are stuck in taxpayer-funded hotels. Could this voluntary Homes for Ukraine scheme be expanded to cover, for example, Afghan refugees as well? Well, that's the proposal that Sundar Kutwala, David Goodhart and Luke Trill have suggested in the pages of The Times this morning, highlighting how asking Homes for Ukraine applicants if they would accept other refugees too could help fix our stalling asylum system. Well, I'm delighted to say that joining me now is one of the authors of that letter to The Times, Luke Trill, the UK director of More in Common, can join me now. Welcome to the programme. First of all, let's talk about the specifics of this proposal. The idea of individuals coming forward to offer their homes. Nothing quite like this has been done before.
No, it is truly unprecedented in the UK, and the numbers of members of the public who've signed up to offer their homes is a real testament to that sort of British spirit of both, generosity and kindness, but also that real sense of duty that we as a country have always done our bit to help those fleeing from persecution, and the public want to make sure they're at the forefront of that in this crisis. And the great thing about sponsorship is this isn't the government saying we're going to take some arbitrary number of refugees and we're just going to put them into communities around the country. It's instead about people and communities stepping up. So it puts them in control of who's coming over and allows them to show their generosity. It's just a total 180 on the very sort of government-led asylum and refugee scheme that we've seen in the past. And what we know is from the other country, which has done sponsorship very well for very many years, is Canada, is that the more that you grow this type of scheme, actually the greater public acceptance of refugees and migration becomes. Tom, from your work on Brexit, that actually people's sense of wanting that control, it's not about saying that we don't want people coming over, but it's about people wanting to say, actually, I want to make sure that we've got levers, and it's about us saying we want people to come and support them, rather than people coming in a sort of uncontrolled manner.
Yes, and so often in these cases, what people are very concerned about is almost ghettoised communities, people who come over and do not integrate into society, perhaps don't learn English and all the rest of it. Whereas coming and staying with a host family in the UK, of course you're going to integrate much more quickly. You're probably going to be speaking English a lot more as well. You're going to take on the customs, the language. You're going to be part of a community. The question is, although there seems to be wide political consent and enthusiasm for this in the case of Ukrainians, how practical is this to expand? And what other groups of refugees could we potentially take out of those very expensive hotels and bring into people's volunteers' homes?
Well, as you said, Tom, we've got over 100,000 people have signed up to offer their home to a Ukrainian refugee. We think that number will continue to grow and perhaps become quite significantly larger in the coming weeks. And it seems likely that not all of those people who volunteered will match with a Ukrainian refugee. And we very much hope that, numbers don't reach the very high numbers of people who will be volunteering to put their homes forward. And what we're saying is, we're not saying that anyone should be forced to take in us. People who've signed up to the scheme have said, we would like to offer a home to a Ukrainian family. What we're saying is, once we've got a clearer picture of who has been matched and who hasn't, that we offer some of those people who haven't yet taken somebody in the opportunity to sponsor an Afghan refugee. And again, we're actually talking about people who are already in the country. Around 12,000 Afghan refugees who were rescued during the evacuation of Kabul airport last year. They're in hotels. That's costing the taxpayer around £1.2 million a day to keep them in hotels. And we're saying, look, why don't we offer some of the people who've stepped forward the opportunity to give their home to one of these refugees as well, which seems a very sort of sensible, practical step. That won't be for everyone, but we're sure that some people will step up and want to do that. And again, that brings then all those benefits. You don't have these ghettoised communities, people in hotels, in refugee centres. They're within our communities and they're being supported to get a job, to learn English, to contribute, to be part of society. And that must be a more sensible approach.
That's extraordinary that 12,000 Afghans who are already in the UK are costing the taxpayer 1.2 million a day in hotels. That 12,000 is barely 10% of the number who have, in the first 24 hours, signed up to this scheme. If only 10% of them would say I'd welcome an Afghan too, that would solve the problem entirely. To what extent do you think you're pushing at an open door with this policy? I mean, it seems just really quite sensible.
Exactly. We think the reason we made the proposal is that we think that it's common sense, but we also know, knowing how systems and government work in times of crisis, people are working flat out and are focused quite rightly on supporting Ukrainian refugees to get into the country to make sure that the scheme works. And we just don't want this opportunity, the fact that so many people have stepped forward, to be lost in and amongst that. So again, it's very much about saying, we recognise people have stepped up to offer a room to a Ukrainian refugee. Once we have a clearer picture on who's being matched, let's just extend that further. We hope it's just a similar common sense step for people who are already in this country and who desperately now want, to be in somewhere just a bit more permanent, where they're getting the support to become, an active part of UK society.
And just finally, in the last few seconds of this interview, Luke, what kind of political support have you seen? Although this is a very nascent campaign, have any MPs come on board, or what do you expect to happen in that space?
Well, we're going to be reaching out to MPs from across the political divide to build support for this proposal. We hope that they will see it as a sort of common sense solution. But as you know, it's early days. But once we have engaged and reached out to more people, we'd love to come back and talk to you about the campaign a bit more.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to doing so. Luke Trill, for now, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing this morning. Really fascinating campaign there. Well, now with Boris Johnson in the UAE today, Prime Minister's questions will be led by Deputy Prime Minister Dominic Raab. He's going to face Labour's Deputy Leader Angela Rayner at the dispatch box. But what can we expect to be said, and will it be a more fiery event than usual? Well, let's talk through this now with Nigel Nelson, political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People. Welcome to the programme. It's always fun, in my book, when Angela Rayner stands up at the dispatch box. Whether you agree with her or not, she does bring a certain passion to events. Can we expect to see that today?
Yes, I think so. Angela is always very entertaining when she's doing it, and I'd imagine she'd be a bit more bullish about Saudi Arabia than Graham Stringer was, who you saw earlier. There is the issue of Saudi human rights, and of course Boris Johnson is effectively going to Saudi Arabia and saying, will you produce some more oil, but will you do it for the same price, which you wouldn't be able to do if you went to a supermarket or something like that. So essentially he's going with a begging bowl, and it's unlikely then he can really start complaining about their human rights record when you're making such a big ask. I'd imagine Angela Rayner would want to explore that one with Dominic Raab about the moral discrepancy about the whole thing. And of course, that then goes on to the cost of living crisis. We've got Rishi Sunak delivering a mini budget next Wednesday in his spring statement. And there's a big question about what he's going to do to bring down costs. And of course, we're facing extra costs because of the sanctions against Russia. So those are the two areas I'd imagine Angela Rayner will go for. But as we're talking now, she's in the middle of her PMQ's briefing, and I'm sure they're scratching their heads and trying to think of other questions for her.
And no doubt trying to think of some witty lines and barbing put-downs as well. Although it is a very tricky position for Dominic Raab, of course, former Foreign Secretary of the country, speaking diplomatically as he does. He's got to toe a very careful line to both match the mood of the House, which will no doubt be fairly critical of Saudi Arabia, but not upset the Saudis in any sort of way as the Prime Minister carries out difficult negotiations.
No, I think that's absolutely true, Tom. And the real issue here is that we're talking about which is the lesser of two evils. I mean, you've got Saudi Arabia still engaged in a really brutal war in Yemen. A lot of that using British weaponry. We export more weapons to Saudi than any other individual country. So all those things have caused disquiet, especially on the Labour benches, but even Tories are actually quite uncomfortable about this. However, you have to balance that with the situation we're now in. If there is a global embargo on Russian oil, you're looking at something like $200 a barrel, which will send prices going through the roof. So the question is what you do about it. It seems to be that the answer is that if we're going to stick up for our principles over Ukraine, all of us have to pay for it. And by that, I mean all. It's not just us as individuals, but I think businesses ought to start thinking about putting wages up a bit higher than perhaps they planned. Rishi Sunak must do something about the cost of living crisis next week. So I would imagine that Angela Rayner will call for something like a duty cut on motor fuel. Then, of course, we've got household bills. And I think the one thing that Rishi Sunak probably won't go back on is the national insurance rise, which is going to increase taxes on an average by about £380 for each person.
Getting into that extraordinary sort of political cross-dressing territory, where the Labour Party is calling to scrap a tax rise and the Conservative government is pushing ahead with a tax rise. It's very unusual territory, but something else that looks a bit cross-dressing today, if we want to extend that metaphor. We have, usually at PMQs, Boris Johnson, some might say a more firebrand kind of politician, but also someone who puts his foot in it occasionally, normally up against the more boring, lawyerly Keir Starmer. Well, today the boring, lawyerly person is Dominic Raab, and Angela Rayner is sort of almost taking on that role of Boris, that firebrand who sometimes puts her foot in it.
Yeah, I suppose that's one way of putting it. I mean, Angela Rayner is certainly more passionate when she gets to the dispatch box than Keir Starmer. But I do think that you've got broadly agreement from the Labour Party and the Conservative Party about what is going on in Ukraine and about sanctioning Russia. So it may not be quite the usual sort of firebrand attack that you would expect from Angela today. Keir Starmer has popped up to Huddersfield for a visit there, so I'm sure he'll try and grab the TV and see if he can see a bit of it. But because there is actually broad agreement about the way that we're tackling Russia, I think the attacks will be quite sharp, but a little bit more muted than usual.
Yes, it is interesting looking at the mood of the House over the last 2 weeks. I mean, the Scottish Conservative leader withdrawing his call for Boris Johnson to resign, a greater sense of unity, a growing stature for the Prime Minister. I suppose there is that angle too, until, of course, we get to the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party in the House of Commons, Ian Blackford. Usually that takes a slightly different tack.
Yes, he does. But again, the Scots Nats again have been sort of broadly supportive of what we're doing about sanctions. And there is the whole question, actually, of Boris Johnson's future. Now, it's quite right that the calls for him to resign over Partygate have now dropped away. We are in the middle of a war, and on the basis of that, you can't bring down the national leader at the same time as that. I'm quite curious, by the way, that the police have not yet come back with their report on whether they're going to fine Boris Johnson and some of the Downing Street staff for their parties. That seems to have gone on the back burner. But I think it's quite right that political leaders now are not calling for Boris Johnson's resignation. Now, as soon as things calm down again, I'm sure that they will. And of course, we've got to look forward to May local elections, which could be very bad for the Tories. Yeah. And there could be people on his own side doing the same thing.
Well, it's going to be fascinating whether it all flares right back up whenever this crisis in Ukraine might reach a conclusion, whatever that might look like. It will be fascinating to watch what happens. It will also be fascinating to see what happens at midday today for PMQs, of course. But for now, Nigel Nelson, political editor of the Sunday Mirror and the Sunday People, thanks for joining us this morning on The Briefing. Well, that's it for the show. Coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick and Anaya. But first, here's the weather.
Good morning, I'm Alex Deakin with your latest weather updates. A much cloudier day today for most, and there'll be some wet weather around as well, but it will be a brighter day for Western Scotland and Northern Ireland. This weather front brought the rain through the course of Tuesday evening, but it's since been slipping southwards and being joined by another one pushing up from the south. And as they come together, they're going to bring quite a wet spell over some parts of England and Wales. Not everywhere seeing the wet weather today, but where we do see it could be on the heavy side, parts of the Midlands, southern England, and then slowly drifting over parts of eastern England also. In Wales, it should turn a little drier through the day and certainly brightening up across much of Scotland, Northern Ireland. Some sunshine here, just a few showers across the far northwest. A cool feeling day, 8, 9, 10 Celsius. Still quite mild across England and Wales, although temperatures not as high as yesterday and obviously not feeling all that pleasant with the wet weather, which, as I said, could be quite heavy and is likely to linger well into the evening over the East Midlands, parts of eastern England before slowly heading out into the North Sea. Behind it, we'll have clear skies overnight, so a hint of blue on the chart. We will see a frost, certainly in many rural areas, towns and cities, perhaps just about staying above. But a cold start to Thursday, but a cracking start, if you like, sunshine. A fine day to come for much of southern and eastern England. But elsewhere, the cloud will increase. Some showery rain for Northern Ireland, western Scotland during tomorrow morning. That spreads into northeast Scotland and leaves a little bit of rain come the afternoon over northwest England, maybe North Wales, but not amounting to much. Mixture of sunshine and showers in the afternoon across Scotland. As I said, the south and east of England generally staying dry and temperatures back up to 15, 16 degrees, 12 or 13 in Glasgow and Edinburgh. And look at this, if you like spring sunshine, there is plenty more to come as we go through Friday and into the weekend. It will be quite windy in places, but temperatures jumping up into the mid-teens.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.